Namaskar and welcome to In Focus. The elections are over and we have a hung parliament, and the tricky question now is, what should the president do? In fact, it's become a subject of controversy in the newspapers and television. With me is one of the country's most respected, its most senior lawyers, former Solicitor General and former Attorney General, Soli Sorabjee, to explain exactly what should be the right course through this political minefield. Mr. Sorabjee, in a hung parliament situation, how should the President of India react?
Well, there is no universal formula. There is no inflexible rule that in a hung parliament, the single largest party must always be called or rather invited to form the government. It differs from situation to situation. For example, let's take a hypothetical case. The required number is 300. I'm getting out from this magic number of 272. The largest single party is 190. Others have, say, 160 and 140. Well, then I suppose, since it's the largest party, the president may call the leader and ask him that, look, you're 190, you're way behind 300. Is there any likelihood? Do you think you will have the support of anyone? Suppose he doesn't even claim the support of any other party, which will make him muster up the figure of 300. Then to ask him to form the government would be a sheer exercise in futility. Because the president has to be satisfied that the person whom he invites to form the government will be able to form a ministry with a reasonable prospect of stability. That's his only aim. The paramount aim of the president is to install a ministry which will be stable, or which he thinks will be reasonably stable for a reasonable period of time.
So there's no cardinal rule that you have to go down the list of parties in order of their size?
Not necessarily. As I said, it differs from situation to situation.
So then in 1996, when former President Shankar Dayal Sharma called upon Mr. Vajpayee, who had only 163 odd members, and even with his allies was no more than 190, did in fact the president do the wrong thing?
Well, I won't say the wrong thing. Maybe he thought he was going to follow the previous precedent, but I thought it wasn't a practical thing. It wasn't a wise thing, because I don't think Mr. Vajpayee even laid claim to a majority. I'm not too sure. I don't think he even said that he would be able to, well, mind you, it's no use saying I may be able to do it. When he meets the president, he should be able to say, in presenti, yes, I think I'm in a position to do it. Able to do it depends. If you give it time, then that gives rise to horse trading. But if a person cannot even reasonably claim majority, or cannot even satisfy any reasonable mind that, yes, there is any likelihood of his commanding the confidence of the House, because that's the president's responsibility, then I think it's a meaningless exercise.
The other interesting thing in what you're saying is that if there is no hard and fast rule about what the president should do, that also means there is no precedent which is inviolate. The president has to use his discretion, and that depends upon situation to situation.
Correct. It differs from situation to situation, except if a certain precedent is there which is all for and all facts, then it's a different matter. But it would not be really possible, even in a court of law with distinguished precedents, and say it turned on its own special facts and circumstances. The president has to think of one thing and one thing alone. I want a government which will be stable, and which is what the people of India require. Who is in a position to do that? So how does he assess it?
So stability and the capacity of an individual to provide a stable government is the only concern in the president's mind.
Correct. Correct.
And those who turn around and say that there is such a thing as a Venkatraman precedent which has been established since '89 and therefore it must continue ad infinitum are actually misunderstanding what President Venkatraman was doing even in '89 and '91 and '92.
Well, let me put it that way, that even if there was a precedent, in the light of the last experience, no precedents are also hardbound. Even if there was a precedent, in light of the experience which we had in 1996, one may have to rethink about that precedent, even if you call it a precedent or a convention.
So the Vajpayee 13-day experience has put a question mark over the precedent.
Let me inform you that actually there is a full-man judgment of the Lucknow bench of the Allahabad High Court. In a case where the BJP had approached the High Court to challenge the presidential proclamation of imposing president's rule, BJP succeeded in that writ petition. But the contention of BJP that the governor in that case should have called the largest single party was not accepted by any of the judges. Unfortunately, of course, the other side came up in appeal, and because of subsequent events, the matter has become infructuous.
What did the judges argue? Did they in fact say that the primary concern of the governor in that case should be
Yes.
the creation of a stable, viable government,
Yes. Oh, yes.
not going down the list of parties just because there is a previous precedent to do
Yes.
so?
The words were that if the leader cannot satisfy the government that he will be able to form a ministry with a reasonable prospect of stability, the governor was not wrong in not asking him to form the government but inviting others. That's an important judgment. Unfortunately, it hasn't been much noticed.
Okay, Mr. Sorabjee, you've clarified the situation in one sense in that you've pointed out there is no hard and fast rule for the president to follow. He has to use his judgment. What he has to seek to provide the country is a viable and stable government. Insofar as laying out the theory, you made it much clearer. But insofar as that theory applies to the present situation, I suspect the whole thing's become a lot trickier. What does the president do in this particular hung parliament where you have, roughly speaking, a BJP and alliance formation at about 252 and possibly a Congress and UF formation which may be just a shade bigger? In these circumstances, how does your theory apply?
Well, even here, prima facie, because of the fact that the lead BJP has got the largest number of seats, and with its allies, it's not way behind. I think the right thing to do would be to call upon the leader of the BJP, or rather ascertain from him, are you in a position to provide a ministry either singly or in combination with other groups or parties? Will you be able to command the muster of the majority? If the answer is yes, the president will say, on what basis do you say that? What are the materials to satisfy me? Then he might say, well, I have a commitment from party A, I have a commitment from party B, and Mr. C or Mrs. D has done it, that the president not even want to be satisfied about the strength of those commitments. What are those commitments? Who has made them? Then he might also sometimes take into account, were these commitments made before, or are these commitments which are made totally contrary to what those individuals or parties said? So it's a very delicate function which the president has to perform.
And
So
there
you
are
keep that
several
in mind.
intricate steps involved in performing it as
Yes,
well.
yes.
Let's take those apart and go through them one by one. It seems from what you're saying that the president first directs his focus of attention towards the leader of the single biggest party, or in this case, the BJP alliance.
Yes, that's
But
my view.
Let me begin by asking you a question there. Why? Why does he not direct his first focus of attention towards a candidate that the UF and Congress might jointly throw up, because together UF and Congress have a few more seats than BJP and the allies? So why doesn't he start there rather than on this end?
Two reasons. UF and Congress have larger seats as a result of what is a post-election alliance. A president may reasonably ask himself the question that if UF, with Congress support, has demonstrated its incapacity of providing a stable government, and that's a historical fact, how will now the change of Congress with UF support guarantee stability? Has there been some overnight transformation, some metamorphosis has happened? And these are the very people, these are the factors which is certainly relevant factors taken into account. Congress brought down the government on the basis of the Joint Commission report, interim report. Its demand was DMK should go, and they said many things about the UF which need not be repeated, but which was certainly not what an alliance partner would say. So one would say that all overnight, this change of heart, change of mind, change of conviction, very well, he doesn't judge that, but he'll keep that also in mind.
So you're saying that
keep it in account. That's a relevant factor which should also put in the balance.
The historical track record of a Congress-UF alliance last time round should be borne in mind by the president this time round in deciding who to call first. Okay,
Right.
that's one of your two factors. What's the second reason?
The second reason, BJP is quite close. It's not far behind. And there is a likelihood that even though you don't have an absolute majority, you can have a working majority in the sense that you can perform the function of carrying on the government.
So there's a sense in which you give them the benefit of the doubt.
Well, I would say they have an edge. I would not benefit of the doubt, you may put it, or rather a presumption in their favor, which is a rebuttable presumption, and that can be tested on the floor of the House.
This would be the fair and proper thing to do.
Well, in my opinion, It will be the fair and proper thing to do. It may not be the ideal thing to do. There are no perfect solutions in this sort of a scenario.
But then let's put it the other way around. It's the least worst thing to do.
Yeah, least unsatisfactory.
Least unsatisfactory. Okay,
Right.
so the first thing you said was that in this present hung parliament, the president should direct his focus of attention towards the BJP, and you've explained the two reasons why that should be the case. You then went on to say, or suggest, that the president might not give Mr. Vajpayee a formal mandate. He might call upon him and ask him to establish that he has a majority, and then ask for certain valid proofs of that majority. Why would he go through it this way? Because Shankar Dayal Sharma in '96 actually gave Vajpayee a mandate with far fewer seats. Why this time are you suggesting the president should go through an exercise of trying to find out whether there is a majority?
No. President Sharma's precedent is not an authoritative ruling of the Supreme Court which is binding. It is a precedent which, to my mind, has lost much of its utility in view of the facts and circumstances which happen. I mean, we have got to face realities. So he's not hidebound. And suppose he had an absolute majority, no problem. But so that he might, in order to see that we don't have a repetition of what happened in 1996, and which, as you know, was pointless having it, may want to be not only reasonably satisfied, maybe more or less convinced. But even then, what I'm trying to point out is the president's assessment of the situation, which of course he makes in a fair, bona fide matter. He's not been guaranteed infallibility. He's not a pope. There's no papal infallibility in his case. That prima facie assessment of his bona fide arrived at will have to be ultimately tested on the floor of the House.
Could there be another reason why this time you suggest the president ought to go through the exercise of getting Mr. Vajpayee to prove he has a majority before he gives him a formal mandate? And that reason could be simply this, that it ensures that the institution of Rashtrapati Bhavan is not just above politics, but is seen to be above politics. Last time round, the Vajpayee experiment, so to speak, the experience, so to speak, made many people turn around and say, perhaps Shankar Dayal Sharma had been hasty. And this time, by asking Mr. Vajpayee to first show and offer commitments of support, Rashtrapati Bhavan would rise above a repeat of the same thing.
Well, actually, Karam, I wouldn't say last time what happened was one view is that you go by the largest majority test and there is nothing involved. The president can't be accused of any sort of bias or political bias. That's one theory. Inflexible rule, largest single party, call him, so no one can attribute any motives to him. As I said, that doesn't work in all cases. But here in this case also, let me tell you that the whole thing is, of course, it's a political decision in a sense. Just as when a court decides election issues, it is a political decision. But it is to be exercised, discharged in a non-partisan manner on the basis of certain materials and facts which the leader, the person who claims that he has the ability, capacity to form a ministry with a reasonable prospect of stability, can satisfy the president.
And non-partisanship has to be seen to be non-partisanship.
Oh, yes.
It simply can't be assumed to be.
No, most important, in fact, as you know, justice should not only be done, but seem to be done. That's very important.
Okay, let me then put something to you. You've been crystal clear in not just explaining how in a hung parliament the options depend upon the president's exercise of discretion, but you've also gone on to explain how in this particular hung parliament you think the president should act. Let me put to you what I think some people would say are the faults, if I may use that phrase, in your suggestion. They would say that the first problem is that by offering a mandate to Mr. Vajpayee when he is critically short of a majority and when at the end of the day no series of proofs that he can provide would be sufficient because the real test is the floor of the House, in a sense you're actually inviting horse trading.
No, I don't agree with that. Here there is every likelihood, if the president is satisfied that there is a likelihood, not only a reasonable prospect, of his being able to form a ministry, it can be a working majority. Don't deny the leader of a party which has got the mandate of the people. Let's be very clear about it. It has got the number of seats which is way ahead of any of the other parties singly. And other parties were not pre-poll alliance partners. That is a factor, I think, which must be kept in mind. Because what do the people feel? There's no question about it that even people otherwise who were not in favor of BJP, the factor which induced them to vote in favor of BJP was that we want a stable government. Let them just go ahead and we want a stable government. And all this communalism and all that, I think, is something which we used to hear about communism 40 years back. That bogey, communism. So ANC is bad. South Africa, support the apartheid regime. Communism. So American aid to various totalitarian states. Communism has changed. Marxism has changed. It's not the same in West Bengal, what was preached by Marx and Lenin and others. So communalism, all that, I'm sure BJP will change. It will not certainly practice what some of the
But the main point you're saying is that
it.
communalism is being brought up today as a political bogey to deflect attention from the correct constitutional course of action.
Well, I think it is a bogey, and very frankly, I'm surprised that how this particular factor, which was used even in the elections, has not gone well with the
Are
people.
you also saying that at the end of the day, this fear of horse trading taking place is the slightly irrelevant fear because it would apply on both sides, whether the president went this way or that?
In fact, I was going to say, unfortunately, it's endemic. I mean, you can't say horse trading in one case and cattle trading in the other case.
Let me put another criticism that would be made of your position. You have laid a certain amount of emphasis and weight on the fact that the BJP should be called first because its alliances are pre-poll based, whereas whatever understanding UF and Congress have achieved is post-poll, and it follows a history of not just discord, but bringing each other's government down. The answer to that is, so what? The Constitution has nothing to do with pre-poll and post-poll alliances, and by giving weight to something the Constitution doesn't talk about, you're adding a value judgment of your own.
The President Constitution may not have it. Any individual, be it you or me or the President, when he makes a judgment, to some extent it's a value judgment. And I think in arriving at that assessment he makes, it is certainly a relevant factor to see that a group which now claims its capacity to form a government with stability was the very same group which has demonstrated its incapacity beyond any doubt. So therefore it doesn't mean it can't do it. So that's a very relevant factor which will make the President hesitate.
But aren't you running the risk of bringing into play a morality that is not really part of our Constitution?
It's not morality. It's a factor. It's capacity to do it. If I used any expression which gave a moral tone, forget it. I'll be totally amoral. I won't say immoral, amoral. Question is, are they in a position to do it? You were not able to do it 2 months back. What has happened overnight? Repeating the same thing. Please tell us.
So it's purely a practical consideration.
It's a practical, realistic consideration, not shutting eyes to the reality of what happened about 2 months ago.
And in the light of that practical consideration, a pre-poll alliance would be, in the eyes of the President, a more binding commitment because it's of older standing than a post-poll one, particularly a post-poll one between people who fought each other and were enemies earlier on.
That's the thing. Not quite right. That's the latter part is more important. Not so much pre-poll and post-poll, but post-poll alliance between whom? Between people who have adopted totally contradictory stands. People who said that one shouldn't vote for the other because they were absolute crooks and they would ruin the country.
Okay, that's a very clear assessment of exactly what you think the President should do, and you've rebutted most of the so-called criticisms of your position. Let's take a break there. I want to come back and talk about a different aspect of this particular controversy. To what extent can we devise mechanisms that takes Rashtrapati Bhavan out of the eye of controversy? Because one way or another, this time, whatever the President does, has suddenly become a party political ping-pong. But first, we're going to take a commercial break. See you in a moment. Welcome back. We're talking to Soli Sorabjee about what is the correct course of action for the President to take in the present hung Parliament and whether that action is going to make him controversial or not. Mr. Sorabjee, it seems that no matter what the President does, his actions are going to be criticized and therefore they're going to become controversial because it's become a subject of what I call party political ping-pong.
Well, I can't understand this. If he has to perform a constitutional function, and which has in the manner, which in the very nature is inherent, that there will be some controversial aspects to it. That doesn't mean that he shouldn't perform that function, be about controversy. For example, when the Supreme Court strikes down legislation, it has sometimes socio-economic legislation. It gets embroiled in controversy. So is there a ground to say, Supreme Court must not decide any of these matters, it will get embroiled in controversy. Supreme Court must not decide election petitions because after all one party or other, it will seem to become political. What is of utmost importance is the manner in which you perform the function.
So what
you
you're
can't
saying,
help being controversial. You can't be. One way or the other, he has to take a judgment. It's bound to be criticized.
so what you're saying is that exercising his discretion is inherent in the office of the president,
Right.
and if in the course that makes him controversial, so
Can't
be
be
it,
helped.
as long as he's exercised it
Quite
correctly.
right. Fairly, objectively, and also seen and perceived to have done it in that manner.
Okay, let me then put to you one of the great justifications that President Venkatraman presented when he created what's today being called the Venkatraman precedent. He
Right.
said that the great virtue of the president going from the single largest to the second single largest and so on down the line is that it put Rashtrapati Bhavan beyond controversy. You're saying that's the wrong approach to the game.
Well, I don't think that's the correct approach, because you cannot, just because you say beyond controversy, avoid that situation by adhering to a rigid formula. It means Rashtrapati ji hasn't to exercise his individual judgment, just to go by some numbers. It can't be, as I pointed out, in some cases that test just won't work. It will break down. So we'll have to exercise his judgment. And just to say beyond controversy, if there's something else which is a better solution than merely counting the numbers and going down the list, that I can understand. But this I don't understand, beyond controversy.
Okay, let me put something to you. You are not just defending the right of the president to exercise his discretion in hung parliamentary situations. You're in fact going one step further. You're saying it's essential he must exercise his discretion. But then what happens to people who turn around and say, when presidents exercise their discretion, they become activists, and an activist president could be a danger to our constitution?
I think those people are constitutional illiterates. If there is one function which the Supreme Court has said very clearly where the president can exercise his discretion, is the choice of the Prime Minister. Otherwise, he acts on the aid and advice of the cabinet, just like in England. In England also, the same principle, the monarch really acts on the aid and advice. But even then, this is the area carved out, this is a specific area carved out. And if he exercises discretion in that matter, he's performing his constitutional function. He doesn't become an activist, any more than a judge becomes an activist when he finds a legislation or executive action totally unconstitutional and strikes it down. There's no question of activists. Then please remove the president. Don't say you have performed the function, but if you perform the function one way or the other, you will be an activist. It's a contradiction in terms.
So those who seek to prevent the president exercising his discretion, or those worse still who seek to remove his discretion, are actually misinterpreting the role of the presidency in our constitution.
Totally. I suggest they read the judgment of the Supreme Court in the leading case of Shamsher Singh, read a little, acquaint themselves a little bit with the constitutional history in England, and thereafter make such judgments and pronounce such opinions.
Then let me put now not a matter of legal interpretation to you, let me put something which is a matter of your personal opinion. This particular president, do you think that he exercises his judgments on the occasions when you've seen him do so properly and fairly?
Quite frankly, I've never seen any president who's so particular about constitutional rectitude and about discharging his function in a manner which should not give the slightest doubt or suspicion of having tilted in favor of one party or the other. So it's an agonizing choice for him, and I think he will ultimately decide according to his lights and according to what is presented to him in the best interests of the country and having regard to constitutional principles. I have no doubt about that at all.
Mr. Sorabjee, for that very clear opinion and for talking to us so freely and openly through this minefield of legal interpretation, thank you very much indeed. That's it for this week. In Focus will be back next week. But for today, from Mr. Sorabjee's residence in New Delhi, goodbye.